May 29th, 1453. The convent of Pantocrator in Constantinople had stood for 300 years as a sanctuary of prayer and healing. By noon that day, it had been transformed into a human auction house. The 160 nuns who had sought protection behind its sacred walls discovered that their vows of chastity meant nothing to the Ottoman soldiers who broke down the doors. What happened in those first 48 hours would set the template for a systematic campaign of brutality that historians have spent centuries trying to document and even longer trying to suppress. The Venetian merchant, Niccolò Barbaro, witnessed the initial assault and recorded details that were later buried in church archives. He described how the soldiers separated the nuns by age. The younger women pulled to one side while the elderly were shoved into the chapel. The Mother Superior, a woman named Theodora, who had led the convent for 23 years, was forced to watch as her sisters were stripped of their habits in the courtyard. Barbaro noted that several soldiers urinated on the discarded religious garments while others laughed. This wasn't random violence. It was calculated desecration designed to break the spirit before breaking the body. Sultan Mehmed II had made promises. Before the final assault on Constantinople, he had issued proclamations guaranteeing protection for religious institutions that surrendered peacefully. The Pantocrator convent had opened its gates without resistance, trusting in the Sultan's word. Those promises lasted exactly as long as it took for the first wave of soldiers to realize that 160 consecrated virgins represented a fortune in the slave markets of Bursa and Edirne. By evening, Ottoman officers were already arguing over who would get first choice of the merchandise. The system that emerged in those chaotic hours would become standard procedure. Nuns under 30 were considered premium stock, especially those from noble families. Their virginity could be verified, their breeding was good, and their religious training made them particularly valuable to certain buyers who enjoyed the psychological element of possessing a woman who had sworn herself to God. Nuns between 30 and 45 were categorized as domestic slaves, suitable for household work or agricultural labor. Those over 45 faced immediate execution unless they possessed specific skills like medical knowledge or literacy that might prove useful. Mother Superior Theodora tried to negotiate. According to Barbaro's account, she offered to convert, to serve, to do anything if her younger sisters could be spared. The Ottoman commander, a man named Zagan Pasha, found this amusing. He had Theodora brought before the assembled nuns and asked her to demonstrate her conversion by spitting on a crucifix. She did it. Then he asked her to kneel and renounce Christ. She did that too. Then he asked her to remove her habit and crawl naked across the courtyard while her sisters watched. She refused. Zagan Pasha had her tongue cut out and threw her body into the well where the convent drew its drinking water. The younger nuns could hear her drowning for almost 10 minutes. The devshirme system that the Ottomans had perfected for collecting Christian boys was now being applied to Christian women with even less restraint. But where the boys were trained as janissaries and could potentially rise to positions of power, the nuns had only one purpose. Within a week, caravans were leaving Constantinople carrying hundreds of women from various convents. The Pantocrator nuns were chained together in groups of 10, still wearing the remnants of their habits so buyers would know what they were purchasing. The symbolism was intentional. These weren't just slaves, they were trophies of conquest, living proof that the Christian God had been defeated. But what happened during the fall of Constantinople was just the opening chapter. The nuns who survived the initial assault and were deemed valuable enough to transport discovered that being selected for sale was not mercy. It was just a different category of hell, and the Ottoman Empire had spent decades perfecting exactly how to exploit that hell for maximum profit. The slave markets of the Ottoman Empire operated with bureaucratic precision that would have impressed any modern corporation. There were standardized forms, quality inspections, and pricing tiers based on carefully calculated variables. When it came to enslaved Christian nuns, the system became even more sophisticated. A document discovered in 1893 in the Ottoman state archives revealed a pricing manual from 1454 that listed nuns as a separate category from regular female slaves, with subsections that detailed exactly how much each type was worth. A nun under 25 from a noble family could fetch 300 gold ducats in Constantinople's main slave market. For context, that was enough money to buy a large house or fund a military campaign. The same woman, if she had been a peasant before taking her vows, was worth maybe 80 ducats. Age was crucial. For every year over 25, the price dropped by approximately 15 ducats. By age 35, most nuns were worth less than common household slaves. By 40, they were considered barely worth the cost of feeding them during transport. The most disturbing aspect of this pricing structure was the verification process. Buyers insisted on proof of virginity, which meant physical examinations conducted in public view. The examinations were performed by women employed specifically for this purpose, usually former slaves themselves, who had learned that cooperating with the system offered better survival odds than resistance. These inspectors would announce their findings to the crowd of potential buyers, describing not just whether a woman was virgin or not, but providing detailed commentary on her physical attributes, health, and likely fertility. The abbess was always examined first. This served a dual purpose. It established dominance by humiliating the leader in front of her followers, and it provided information about the entire group. If the abbess came from nobility, the assumption was that at least some of her nuns did too. If she was literate, others likely were as well. The abbess of the convent of Theotokos, a woman named Anna, was subjected to this examination in the main square of Edirne in June 1453. A Genoese merchant named Giacomo Langasco recorded the event in his business ledger, not out of moral outrage, but because he was calculating potential investments. Langasco wrote that Anna maintained complete silence during the examination, staring straight ahead while the inspector announced that she was approximately 38 years old, had never borne children, and showed signs of malnutrition from the siege. She was valued at 45 ducats. 12 of her nuns, all under 30, were valued between 200 and 280 ducats each. The remaining 23 were priced below 60 ducats. Langasco noted that the lower-priced nuns began weeping when their values were announced, as if the specific number somehow quantified their worth as human beings. The inspector slapped 3 of them for crying, explaining to the buyers that emotional stability was an important factor in pricing. But the marketplace was just the sorting mechanism. The real horror came in understanding who was buying and why. Ottoman officials purchased nuns as gifts for foreign dignitaries, a way of demonstrating both the empire's power and its contempt for Christian symbols. Wealthy merchants bought them as household managers, particularly valuing their literacy and organizational skills developed in convent administration. Provincial governors acquired them to oversee female work camps, where their religious authority could be perverted into enforcing discipline on other enslaved women. Then there were the specialty buyers, men who specifically sought out nuns because of their religious status. These purchasers paid premium prices, sometimes double the standard rate, for women who had taken permanent vows. They weren't interested in simple ownership. They wanted the psychological destruction that came from corrupting someone who had dedicated their life to God. Account books from the period show that these buyers often returned to purchase multiple nuns over time, suggesting that whatever they were doing, the women didn't survive it for long. The nuns who weren't purchased at all faced a different fate. The unsold inventory, mostly women over 40, or those who had become too traumatized to function, were disposed of efficiently. Some were sold in bulk to labor camps in Anatolia, where life expectancy rarely exceeded 2 years. Others were given to military units as communal property, a reward for soldiers who had performed well in battle. A few were simply killed outright, their bodies dumped in rivers or left in ditches outside city walls. Abbess Anna and her nuns from Theotokos were separated at the auction. The 12 valuable young women were purchased by different buyers within hours. Anna and 5 of the older nuns were bought as a group by a merchant who specialized in textile production. The remaining 16 were sold to a labor contractor who shipped them east toward the mining regions. Langasco noted in his ledger that he watched Anna's face as her younger sisters were led away in chains. He wrote that she looked relieved, as if being separated was somehow better than staying together to witness what came next. That relief was premature, because the women who were sold, especially those deemed valuable enough for individual purchase, were about to discover that there were fates significantly worse than death. The system had procedures for everything, including the breaking of a nun's spirit, and the Ottomans had refined those procedures into something approaching an art form. What waited for these women in the households and harems of the empire would make the humiliation of the auction block seem like mercy by comparison. The conversion houses operated in every major Ottoman city by 1455. These weren't prisons in the traditional sense. They were institutions specifically designed to break the psychological resistance of Christian religious women. The building in Bursa that processed the most nuns was a converted monastery, which added a layer of intentional irony. The women who had once prayed in similar spaces were now being systematically stripped of everything that had defined their identity as brides of Christ. Sister Maria, one of the 12 young nuns from the Theotokos convent, was purchased by an Ottoman official named Mahmud Pasha. She was 22 years old, literate in Greek and Latin, and from a minor noble family in Morea. Mahmud didn't take her to his home immediately. Instead, she spent 4 months in a conversion house in Constantinople. A Turkish administrator's report from 1454, discovered in the Topkapi Palace archives in 1967, detailed the exact procedures used in these facilities. The document was clinical in its precision, describing methods of psychological manipulation that wouldn't seem out of place in a modern interrogation manual. The first week was about disorientation. Women were stripped of any remaining personal items, including religious medals, prayer beads, or scraps of fabric from their habits. They were given Turkish names and forbidden from speaking Greek or Latin. Guards would wake them at random hours, sometimes every 2 hours throughout the night, preventing any normal sleep cycle from forming. Food was provided irregularly, never at predictable times, so the women couldn't anticipate when they might eat next. The goal was to create a state of constant uncertainty, where the women lost all sense of control over even basic bodily functions. The second phase involved what the documents called instructional humiliation. The women were required to attend Islamic prayer sessions, but were deliberately given incorrect information about how to perform them. When they inevitably made mistakes, they were punished for disrespecting Islam. This created an impossible situation where they were punished for not participating in Islamic practices and also punished for participating incorrectly. The psychological trap was intentional. It taught them that there was no right answer, no way to avoid punishment, and that their only hope was complete surrender to whatever was demanded of them in the moment. Sister Maria's case file, part of the same archive discovery, noted that she resisted for 47 days. She refused to use her Turkish name, continued to pray in Latin under her breath, and attempted to organize other women into maintaining their Christian identity. The response was calculated. She wasn't beaten or physically harmed. Instead, she was placed in a small room with a 60-year-old nun from a different convent, a woman named Irene, who had already broken after 3 weeks. Irene had been instructed to explain to Maria exactly what would happen if she continued to resist. What Irene described wasn't torture in the conventional sense. It was a system of incremental destruction. Women who refused to convert after 3 months were sent to military brothels where they serviced 20 to 30 soldiers per day until they either converted, died, or went insane. Those who went insane were sold to medical practitioners who used them for anatomical study while they were still alive. Those who died were simply replaced. Irene explained all of this in a flat, emotionless voice, while guards watched through a slot in the door. Then she told Maria that she had seen this happen to 4 women in the past month alone. She described their screams, their physical deterioration, and their eventual complete psychological collapse. Maria converted on day 53. The documentation notes that she recited the Shahada, the Islamic declaration of faith, in a clear voice without being physically coerced. She was then given new clothes, better food, and moved to a different section of the facility where successful conversions were housed. But the conversion was just the beginning of her actual purpose. 3 weeks later, she was delivered to Mahmud Pasha's household, where she discovered what being a converted nun really meant in Ottoman society. Mahmud Pasha's harem contained 14 women. 8 were Turkish or Circassian, born into families that had willingly provided daughters to powerful men. 3 were Greek Christians who had converted and married into the household through normal channels. Maria and 2 other former nuns were different. They occupied a specific role that had been developed explicitly for women like them. They were kept separate from the other women, housed in a different wing of the complex, and subjected to what the household records called continued instruction. The other women in the harem were forbidden from speaking to them, except to give orders. They were required to attend Islamic prayers 5 times daily, but unlike the others, their participation was scrutinized by Mahmud himself. Any hesitation, any sign that their conversion wasn't complete and genuine, was noted and punished. The punishments were never physical violence. They were psychological. Mahmud would have Christian prisoners brought to the household and would force Maria to watch, as they were given the choice to convert or die. When they chose death, Mahmud would ask Maria if she understood that her own conversion had been the right choice. She was required to say yes, and to explain why out loud. After 6 months, Maria was pregnant. The pregnancy wasn't accidental. Mahmud had specifically waited until he believed her conversion was irreversible before impregnating her. A pregnant former nun represented the ultimate symbol of conquest. It demonstrated that not only had the woman's body been conquered, but her entire purpose had been inverted. She who had sworn virginity to God was now carrying the child of a Muslim master. The psychological weight of this was intentional and carefully calculated. But pregnancy brought a new horror. Mahmud began introducing Maria to other Ottoman officials as his converted bride of Christ, making her religious past a central part of her identity in his social circle. She was required to tell the story of her conversion at dinner parties, to explain how she had seen the error of Christianity and embraced the truth of Islam. Other officials began asking Mahmud where they could acquire similar women. The market for converted nuns became a status symbol among wealthy Ottomans, and Mahmud was considered an expert in the process. Maria gave birth to a son in 1455. She was allowed to keep the child, but under specific conditions. She had to raise him as a devout Muslim, and had to regularly denounce her former Christian faith in front of him as he grew older. When the boy was 5 years old, Mahmud had him ask Maria questions about Christianity, which she was required to answer by explaining why Christian beliefs were false. If she showed any hesitation or emotion during these sessions, Mahmud would remind her that refusing to properly educate her son in Islam could result in the child being taken away and raised by others. The system was designed to make escape impossible, not through physical chains, but through psychological ones. By giving Maria a child, Mahmud had created a hostage that she would never willingly leave. By forcing her to actively participate in her son's Islamic education, he made her complicit in the erasure of her own identity. She was trapped in a situation where every maternal instinct was weaponized against her former self. But Maria's situation, as horrific as it was actually one of the better outcomes for converted nuns. At least she was in a household with some level of stability and structure. Other women faced conversion processes that were far more brutal, serving buyers who had purchased them specifically because they enjoyed the act of breaking religious women. For those nuns, conversion wasn't about joining a household. It was about surviving long enough to find a way to die. The child born to a former nun existed in a specific legal category in Ottoman society. These children were documented in household records with notations that identified their mothers as former Christian religious women. This wasn't accidental record-keeping. It was intentional marking that would follow these children throughout their lives. The stigma served multiple purposes. It reminded the mother of what she had been. It demonstrated the father's power to completely possess a woman who had belonged to God, and it created a permanent underclass of individuals who could never fully integrate into Ottoman society. Fatma, the Turkish name given to a nun originally called Sister Catherine, gave birth to 3 children between 1456 and 1461. She had been purchased by a lower-ranking Ottoman official in Edirne, a man named Hassan who worked in the provincial tax administration. Unlike Mahmud Pasha's household, Hassan's home was not wealthy or particularly refined. Fatma was his only slave, serving as both concubine and domestic worker. Her children, 2 daughters and a son, were raised in a household where their mother's past was never forgotten or forgiven. Ottoman inheritance law presented a complex problem for these children. In standard Islamic practice, children born to slave concubines could be recognized by their fathers and given inheritance rights, though usually less than children born to legal wives. However, children of converted nuns fell into a gray area. Some Islamic legal scholars argued that because the mothers had committed the grave sin of breaking their religious vows to God, even if to a false god, the children carried a spiritual taint. Others argued that the conversion absolved the sin, and the children should be treated normally. Hassan chose to follow the stricter interpretation. His children were raised in his household, but were never formally recognized as his heirs. When his son turned 12, the age when Ottoman boys typically began serious education or training, Hassan sold him to a merchant caravan as a laborer. The boy disappeared into the Anatolian interior, probably dead before he reached 20. The 2 daughters were married off at 13 and 14 to men who were specifically looking for wives with no family connections, who could be easily controlled. Fatma was forced to arrange these marriages herself, negotiating deals that she knew would result in her daughters living lives of servitude similar to her own. The psychological torture of being forced to participate in her children's destruction was documented in a letter that survived by accident. In 1462, a Greek merchant named Constantine Lascaris was conducting business in Edirne and stayed in a caravanserai near Hassan's property. He wrote to his brother in Crete describing strange sounds he heard at night, a woman crying in Greek and praying. He investigated and discovered Fatma, who had managed to slip out of the house briefly. She told him her story in rushed, panicked whispers, and begged him to send word to any surviving Christian communities that former nuns should kill themselves rather than allow capture. Lascaris wrote that Fatma described watching her son being led away in chains, knowing she would never see him again, and being unable to even cry openly because Hassan would beat her for showing attachment to a child he had decided to dispose of. She told Lascaris about her daughters, married to men who treated them as unpaid servants and sexual property, and how she was forced to tell them this was a normal life. The worst part, she said, was that her children blamed her. They saw her as the source of their low status, the reason they couldn't have normal lives. They had learned to be ashamed of their mother's past as a nun, exactly as Ottoman society intended. But there were even darker categories of children born to former nuns. Some buyers purchased nuns specifically to breed them, operating what amounted to human farming operations. These men would keep multiple former nuns, impregnate them systematically, and then dispose of the children through various means. Infant mortality in the Ottoman Empire was already high, running above 40% in most regions. For children born to enslaved former nuns in these breeding operations, the mortality rate approached 80%. A document discovered in 1923 in the Bulgarian State Archives detailed one such operation outside of Sofia. An Ottoman landowner named Mehmed maintained a property where he kept 11 former nuns from various Balkan convents. Between 1458 and 1467, these women gave birth to 34 children. Only 6 survived to age 10. The document, part of a property inheritance dispute after Mehmed's death, listed the women and children as agricultural assets, alongside livestock and equipment. The children who did survive these operations often showed signs of severe developmental problems, the result of maternal malnutrition, lack of medical care, and the trauma that pregnant enslaved women transmitted to their fetuses. They were kept on the property and used as laborers from age 5 or 6, performing dangerous agricultural work that regularly resulted in injury or death. The surviving nun mothers were forced to continue bearing children, until they either died in childbirth or became too damaged to conceive. What happened to nuns who refused to bear children was documented in household records that treated pregnancy as a requirement rather than a biological possibility. Women who failed to conceive after repeated attempts were often sold or given away, usually to buyers interested in hard labor rather than reproduction. But women who deliberately tried to prevent pregnancy through various historical methods, everything from herbal concoctions to physical trauma, faced punishment that was meant to serve as warning to others. A court record from 1461 in Constantinople documented the case of a former nun named Theodora who had been caught attempting to induce a miscarriage. She was 4 months pregnant, and her owner discovered she had been consuming pennyroyal, a herb known to cause uterine contractions. The punishment was public. Theodora was taken to the marketplace where she had originally been sold, and was whipped, while a court official explained her crime to the assembled crowd. The beating was severe enough that she miscarried during the punishment. She was then sold at a discount to a mining operation in Anatolia, considered damaged goods. The message was clear. Former nuns existed to serve whatever purpose their owners decided, and that included reproduction, whether they consented or not. The children born from these forced pregnancies were weapons used against their mothers, constant reminders that their vows of chastity had been violated, and that they were now producing Muslim children who would grow up despising what their mothers had once been. For women like Fatma, watching her children disappear into lives of hardship and servitude while being unable to even acknowledge her grief was its own form of execution, just one that took place over years instead of minutes. She was dying piece by piece, watching parts of herself being destroyed systematically while being forced to smile and claim she was grateful for her conversion. But while these individual women suffered in households across the Ottoman Empire, something even more disturbing was happening at the institutional level. The Catholic Church, the very organization that these nuns had devoted their lives to serving, was making calculated decisions about whether these women were worth saving, and the answer they arrived at would reveal a level of cynical political calculation that made Ottoman brutality look almost honest by comparison. Pope Nicholas V received his first detailed report about the fate of Constantinople's nuns in August 1453, 3 months after the city fell. The report came from Cardinal Isidore of Kiev, who had been in Constantinople during the siege and barely escaped with his life. Isidore's letter, preserved in the Vatican's secret archives and made partially public in 1981, contained graphic descriptions of what had happened to the religious women of the city. He estimated that over 800 nuns from various convents had been captured, sold, or killed. He begged the Pope to organize a rescue mission, or at least to publicly condemn the Ottoman treatment of consecrated women. Pope Nicholas V's response, discovered in the same archive release, was dated September 1453. It was 2 paragraphs long. The Pope expressed sorrow for the fall of Constantinople and promised to pray for the souls of those who had suffered. He made no mention of military action, diplomatic pressure, or even public condemnation. The letter ended with instructions for Isidore to be discreet in his discussions of the matter, as inflammatory reports might damage ongoing negotiations with various European powers regarding a potential crusade. That crusade never materialized. What did materialize was a carefully orchestrated campaign of silence. Letters from bishops in territories bordering the Ottoman Empire began arriving in Rome throughout 1454 and 1455. The Bishop of Durazzo wrote about convents being systematically emptied along the Adriatic coast. The Archbishop of Ohrid reported that nuns were being transported through his territory in slave caravans, chained and barely clothed. The Bishop of Modon described meeting a group of former nuns who had been ransomed by Christian merchants and were trying to return to church protection, only to find that no convents would accept them because their vows had been violated. Each letter received essentially the same response: express sympathy, promise prayers, and avoid taking any action that might antagonize the Ottoman Empire or complicate European politics. By 1456, the bishops had largely stopped writing. They understood that Rome had made a calculation. The nuns were an acceptable loss in a larger political game. The political game was complex, but ultimately cynical. Pope Nicholas V and his successor, Calixtus III, were trying to organize a unified European response to Ottoman expansion. This required cooperation from Venice and Genoa, the two major maritime powers with the military capability to challenge Ottoman control of the Mediterranean. Both Venice and Genoa had extensive trade relationships with the Ottoman Empire. Both were making enormous profits from that trade, and both were deeply involved in the slave trade that was processing the captured nuns. A Venetian Senate record from 1455, discovered by historian Elizabeth Zachariadou in 1973, documented a debate about whether Venice should join a proposed papal crusade. One senator, Marco Donato, argued that Venice's merchants were earning 40,000 ducats annually from slave trade commissions in Ottoman territories. He provided a breakdown. Approximately 15% of that revenue came from the sale of enslaved Christian religious women, primarily nuns. Donato argued that joining a crusade would destroy this revenue stream and potentially cost Venice access to Ottoman markets entirely. The Senate voted against joining the crusade. Similar debates were happening in Genoa, Ragusa, and other Christian trading cities. The economic benefits of maintaining good relations with the Ottomans outweighed any moral considerations about the fate of consecrated women. The truly disturbing part was how explicitly this was stated in the records. These weren't secret dealings or hidden arrangements. Christian merchants and politicians were openly acknowledging that they were profiting from the enslavement and brutalization of Christian nuns, and they were making rational economic arguments for why this should continue. The conspiracy of silence extended to suppressing the testimonies of survivors. Some nuns did escape or were ransomed. When they tried to tell their stories, they found that no one wanted to hear them. The Church had developed a theological position that these women, having been defiled and potentially converted to Islam under duress, were no longer suitable for religious life. Several convents explicitly refused to accept former captives, arguing that they would contaminate the purity of the remaining sisters. Sister Eugenia of Thessaloniki was ransomed by her family in 1457 after 3 years in Ottoman captivity. She had been purchased by a merchant in Bursa who specialized in training enslaved women for household management. Eugenia had been forced to convert, had been repeatedly raped, and had given birth to a daughter who died at age 2. When she returned to Thessaloniki, her family petitioned the local bishop to allow her to return to religious life. The bishop refused. He wrote that while Eugenia's suffering was regrettable, she had spoken Islamic prayers and had borne a Muslim child. She could not resume her vows. Eugenia's family then tried to have her story documented as testimony for potential legal action against the Ottomans. They brought her to a church notary who was supposed to record her account. The notary wrote 3 pages describing her capture and initial transport. When Eugenia began describing what happened in the merchant's household in Bursa, the notary stopped writing. He told her family that recording such details would serve no purpose and might actually harm efforts to maintain peace with the Ottomans. The testimony was filed incomplete and eventually disappeared from church records entirely. This pattern repeated across former Byzantine territories. Survivors were either ignored, actively discouraged from speaking, or had their testimonies buried in archives where they wouldn't complicate diplomatic relations. The Church was making a calculated decision that these women's suffering was less important than maintaining the political status quo, but the suppression went even deeper. Documents began disappearing from church archives. Letters from bishops describing atrocities were removed from official correspondence files. Records of ransom negotiations were destroyed. By the early 1500s, there was a systematic effort to erase the documentary evidence of what had happened to the nuns of Constantinople and the surrounding regions. The erasure was so successful that by the 17th century, most European Christians had no idea that thousands of nuns had been enslaved, raped and tortured following the Ottoman conquests. The fall of Constantinople was remembered as a military defeat and the end of the Byzantine Empire, but the specific fate of the religious women had been scrubbed from popular memory. This wasn't an accident. It was the result of 150 years of institutional decisions to prioritize political stability and economic profit over the lives and dignity of women who had dedicated themselves to the church. A few survivors lived long enough to see this erasure happen. They watched as their experiences were dismissed, minimized, and eventually forgotten. Some wrote private letters or diaries trying to preserve their testimony for future generations. Most of those documents were destroyed by family members who feared the social stigma of being associated with women who had been Ottoman slaves. But a handful of documents survived, hidden in private collections, misfiled in archives, or preserved by accident in libraries that didn't fully catalogue their holdings. When historians began finding these documents in the 20th century, they revealed something stunning. The silence hadn't been an oversight or a tragic failure of communication. It had been deliberate policy, executed systematically and maintained for centuries. The Catholic Church and the Christian merchants of Europe had made a conscious choice to sacrifice the nuns of Constantinople and let their suffering be forgotten in the service of larger political and economic goals. The women who endured years of brutality, who watched their sisters die, who bore children to their rapists, who had their identities systematically destroyed, discovered that the institution they had devoted their lives to serving had decided they weren't worth the political inconvenience of acknowledging. And that betrayal, in its own way, was as devastating as anything the Ottomans had done. The first major archaeological discovery came in 2003 during renovation work on a mosque in Edirne that had once been a Christian convent. Workers broke through a sealed basement room that wasn't shown on any building plans. Inside, they found the skeletal remains of 23 women. The bones showed evidence of severe malnutrition, multiple healed fractures, and marks consistent with prolonged restraint. Several skulls showed signs of blunt force trauma. The Turkish authorities initially classified this as a historical curiosity and prepared to rebury the remains quietly. Then, archaeologists examined the room more carefully. Scratched into the walls were prayers in Greek, dates ranging from 1454 to 1461, and names. Sister Anna of Pantokrator, Sister Theodora of Theotokos, Sister Maria of Kora. These weren't random Christian women who had died during the conversion of a church to a mosque. These were nuns who had been kept in this room for years. The scratch marks on the door indicated repeated attempts to escape. Chemical analysis of the walls revealed the presence of human waste, suggesting the women had been confined in this space continuously for extended periods. The Turkish government permitted a full forensic analysis in 2005. The results were published in the European Journal of Archaeology in 2007 and were immediately controversial. The 23 women had died between the approximate ages of 20 and 35. Evidence of healed pelvic fractures suggested multiple childbirths. Signs of bone disease indicated vitamin D deficiency from lack of sunlight. But the most disturbing finding was in the pattern of injuries. Multiple women showed evidence of deliberate bone breaking that had healed, suggesting systematic torture over long periods. One skeleton in particular caught the attention of forensic pathologists. A woman approximately 25 years old at death showed evidence of having had her jaw broken and reset at least twice. Her teeth had been deliberately removed, not through decay, but through extraction. Several fingers showed signs of having been broken individually. The pathologist's report suggested these injuries were inflicted over a period of at least 2 years, allowing time for partial healing between incidents. This was torture stretched out over time, designed to cause maximum suffering while keeping the victim alive. The discovery prompted a review of Ottoman administrative records. Researchers at Boğaziçi University in Istanbul began systematically examining tax records, property transfers, and estate inventories from the 1450-1480 period. They found repeated references to converted Christian women in household inventories, listed alongside furniture and livestock. Some entries included valuations that tracked depreciation over time. A woman valued at 200 ducats in 1455 might be valued at 30 ducats in 1465, with notations explaining the decreased value was due to age, injury, or illness. One estate inventory from 1467 belonging to an Ottoman official named Iskender Pasha, listed 5 former nuns among his household property. The document noted that 2 had died in the past year, 1 from childbirth complications and 1 from unspecified illness. Of the 3 surviving women, the inventory noted that 1 was no longer suitable for breeding due to damage and recommended her sale to agricultural labor contractors. This clinical language appeared in dozens of similar documents. These weren't isolated cases. This was standard property management applied to human beings. The researchers also found court records dealing with disputes over ownership of enslaved nuns. In 1459, 2 Ottoman merchants went to Islamic court to resolve a disagreement over a batch of nuns purchased together in Constantinople. One merchant claimed that several of the women had died due to the other merchant's negligence during transport, decreasing the value of his investment. The court ruled in favor of the plaintiff and ordered compensation based on estimated market value of healthy nuns of similar age and background. These documents revealed something that the conspiracy of silence had successfully hidden for 5 centuries. The enslavement, brutalization, and systematic destruction of Christian nuns hadn't been a chaotic byproduct of conquest. It had been an organized industry with established procedures, market rates, and legal frameworks. The Ottoman Empire had created an entire system for processing consecrated Christian women, and that system had operated efficiently for decades. Letters discovered in the Dubrovnik State Archives in the 1980s provided the survivor perspective. A group of letters written between 1480 and 1490 by a woman named Elena contained references to her past as Sister Anastasia of a Greek convent. She had been ransomed after 25 years in Ottoman captivity and was living in Dubrovnik under the protection of a merchant family. Her letters to a cousin in Venice described her experiences in careful, coded language, clearly afraid that being too explicit would cause problems. Elena wrote about the basement rooms where resistant nuns were kept. She described how women who refused to convert completely were confined in darkness for months at a time, brought out only for Islamic prayer sessions where their failures to perform correctly were punished. She mentioned other nuns who had gone mad from the confinement and had to be killed because they were no longer valuable as slaves. She wrote about women who had deliberately provoked their owners into killing them because death was preferable to continued existence. But the most chilling part of Elena's letters was her description of what happened to nuns who outlived their usefulness. She wrote about a group of women, all over 40 and no longer capable of bearing children or performing heavy labor, who were taken to a rural property outside Bursa. She had heard from other slaves that the women were simply killed and buried in unmarked graves. When she asked why they weren't just released, given that they had no value anymore, another enslaved woman explained that releasing former nuns who knew details about how the system worked would be dangerous. Dead women couldn't testify. Elena's letters suggested that this disposal of older enslaved nuns was common practice. She estimated, based on conversations with other survivors, that fewer than 10% of nuns captured in the initial conquests of 1453-1460 survived beyond 1480. The majority had died from childbirth complications, disease, overwork, or deliberate killing. The few who survived into old age did so because they had developed skills that kept them valuable, like literacy, medical knowledge, or the ability to manage other enslaved women. The final archaeological evidence came from ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted near former Ottoman properties in Bulgaria in 2011. Researchers identified several sites with concentrations of human remains that didn't correspond to known cemeteries. Excavation of one site revealed the skeletal remains of approximately 60 individuals, all female, buried without any Islamic or Christian burial rites. Chemical analysis dated the burials to the mid to late 15th century. The bones showed evidence of hard labor, malnutrition, and violent death. What emerged from all this evidence was a picture of systematic brutality that had been successfully hidden for over 500 years. The Ottoman Empire had created an infrastructure for capturing, processing, exploiting, and ultimately disposing of Christian religious women. The Catholic Church had known about it and chosen silence over intervention. Christian merchants had profited from it and opposed efforts to stop it, and the women who survived had been silenced, marginalized, and eventually erased from historical memory. The irony was bitter. These women had devoted their lives to serving an institution that abandoned them when protecting them became politically inconvenient. They had taken vows of chastity that were brutally violated, while the church that received those vows calculated whether their suffering was worth jeopardizing trade agreements. They had believed in a God who would protect the faithful, only to discover that faith meant nothing when measured against political and economic interests. The final insult was the erasure. For 5 centuries, their suffering was treated as less important than maintaining comfortable narratives about Christian-Muslim relations in the late medieval period. Their testimonies were suppressed, their graves were unmarked, their names were forgotten. The institutional church that they had served decided that acknowledging what happened to them was less important than preserving relationships with political powers and maintaining theological positions about purity and defilement. When the evidence finally emerged in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, it revealed a truth that was difficult for many historians to accept. The fall of Constantinople wasn't just a military defeat. It was the beginning of a decades-long campaign of brutalization against Christian religious women, executed with bureaucratic precision, enabled by Christian complicity, and buried through deliberate institutional amnesia. The nuns of Constantinople and the conquered Byzantine territories had been sacrificed twice, once to Ottoman conquest and once to European political convenience. Their legacy isn't just in the horror of what was done to them. It's in the revelation of how institutions, both Islamic and Christian, chose to treat vulnerable women when protecting them, conflicted with other interests. It's in the documentation of how systematic violence can be organized, normalized, and profited from. And it's in the reminder that historical silence is never neutral. Someone always benefits when certain stories aren't told. The women in that basement in Edirne, who scratched their names and prayers into the walls while they were tortured to death, left behind one final testimony. They existed. They suffered. And for 550 years, no one cared enough to remember. That might be the worst part of all.